But every time I'm tempted to doubt, I open my Bible and I see a little blue sticker. And if God is able to do that right back at the very beginning when we weren't a known organization, then I think we can just trust him because he's good and he cares far more about ending slavery than I'll ever be capable of.
You are now listening to the Mod Pod, where we share what adulting with Christ looks like and sharing powerful testimonies of faith and breakthrough.
Your testimony about how you made it through will bless somebody else like that.
Introducing your host, Shane DeLeon.
What is going on, family? Welcome back to the Mind of DeLeon podcast. My name is Shane Bryan, and I am here with a special guest right now. Her name is Miss Becky Murray, and she is the founder of One by One. It's a Christian organization dedicated to ending human trafficking. She's spoken at the White House. She's spoken at the Houses of Parliament relating to these issues. So she's gonna just go in depth and share her testimony. And once again, I hope you guys really enjoy this. A woman of God, a servant as well, and just a pure-hearted person. So, Becky, the floor is yours, okay?
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to be with you today. Yes, my name's Becky Murray. I'm the founder of an organization called One by One, and our heart is to end exploitation of the vulnerable. So when I was an 18-year-old, I went on a short-term trip with my local church. We went over to Romania, and it was there that for the first time in my life, I felt God speak to my heart. It wasn't audible, but it was very clear about working with vulnerable children. And so I felt like I'd been given this promise, but then I had no idea what to do with that promise. Like, what do you do? Like, you come home and you do what? You just book a flight to Timbuktu and just go start something somewhere? And so I held on to this promise for a long time. And then in 2006, so 2 decades ago, I went on yet again another short-term missions trip with my local church. And this time it was to Sierra Leone. And it was only my second ever time on the continent of Africa. And I remember this particular day meeting a little girl who lived on the streets. Her mum and dad had both passed away. And so she would beg on the streets just in order to survive from day to day. And I simply noticed she had no shoes. Now, I do a lot of work across rural Africa now, but back then I wasn't used to seeing a child with no shoes. I now realize that in many rural parts, that is quite commonplace. But it was my second time on the continent, and I was just so moved to see this little girl have nothing, not even a pair of shoes. And so at the time, I was a student. I was studying pediatric nursing at university. And so if I'm honest, I'd saved up all of my money just to get on the trip. So by the time I was there, I didn't have a great deal left over. But what I did have with me this particular day was the English equivalent of 50 pence. And so with my very feeble small gift, I went to the marketplace and bought a pink pair of flip-flops to give to this little 9-year-old. Well, that evening, she had asked locals where are the British teams staying. And so they must have told her where our hotel was. And so I remember being stood outside the hotel and seeing this little 9-year-old running down the street, running towards me. And she said, "Should I wait in the hotel for you?" So I said, "No, we're just about to head out." And she said again, "Yes, but shouldn't I just wait in your bedroom?" And if I'm honest, Shane, I think if this little girl had said that to one of the men on the team, I would have understood the question. But I was in my early 20s, and to have this tiny little 9-year-old ask another young girl, "Should I wait in your bedroom?" I literally couldn't comprehend what the question even was. And so I asked her a third time, and she explained she thought that I'd spent 50 pence on her so that I could have her body. And in that moment, I was so moved and so angry, I guess, not at the little girl, obviously, but angry at the injustice of, firstly, any human being bought or sold. Like, no one should ever be bought or sold. No amount of money can ever be placed upon a human's life. It's far too much value, you know? But for a 9-year-old to think it over a pair of flip-flops just really scarred my heart. And I remember in that moment looking this little girl in the eyes, and to this day, 2 decades on, it still chokes me up. But I remember looking her in the eyes and having a conversation with God. And the conversation was this: okay, I am all in. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know how to begin, but I will give my life to this, because no child should think that they can be bought for 50 pence. And so in that moment, one by one was quite literally birthed in my heart. You know, it started right there with one child. Fast forward, we've now had the honour of working with more than 51,000 kids around the world. But it started right there on the streets of Sierra Leone with one child. And I think the beauty of how God has worked in my life is he's given me one step at a time. I think as a young 20-something-year-old, if I'd have felt this challenge to go and work with thousands of kids around the world, I would have just said no. It's too big. It's too hard. I'm from a very working class background myself. My dad was a postman and my mum was a cleaner. And so I came from a very humble upbringing. And I would have thought, no, you need to go and ask someone who's got more money, or someone who's maybe more influential, or someone who's like really academic. Like, God, you should choose a special person. You couldn't use just a normal person like me, sure. And yet, I think sometimes the reality is, if we're just willing to do something with our lives, even if it's just for that one person, I think if we live our lives like that every day, we can do a great deal of good through our lives. And little did I realise the impact of a 50 pence donation, how decades later that moment is still transforming thousands of kids' lives, but also my own life. And I wish that I could tell you today, 2 decades on, that little girl now works for One by One, or she's now an accountant, or she's whatever. The reality is, back then, there was no safe place to refer her on to. There was nowhere that I knew of. There was no non-profit. And leaving that girl still on the streets is a moment that continues to challenge me, continues to pain me. We actually went back years later and have tried to find her since then and have never been able to. But I think because of that, she is my driving force to keep on rescuing that next one child. And every time we now have the honour of taking a child out of trafficking, seeing them restored and taking them back home, I think in my heart, it's like I'm helping that 9-year-old back in Sierra Leone again and again and again. So she put a face to a global problem. I'd had this exciting promise from God that I felt in my heart about helping vulnerable kids, but that promise was just that. It was just an exciting promise where I could run with the promise when my life was going great, but if life became difficult or busy or challenging, I could put it to one side and focus on me, myself, and I. And then when life's good again, maybe then I'll re-pick up the promise. But from the day I met the 9-year-old, it was no longer a negotiable subject. Like, I have to give my life to this. And so she changed everything. She brought an urgency to the situation. And so from that point on, we started running with One by One. I was given a piece of land in Kenya to build our first residential centre. And everything was like super exciting at this moment in time, because I've just been given this amazing plot of land. So I now know where we're going to build our first residential centre and work with these vulnerable kids. But then reality hit home when I was suddenly given a bill of $150,000. I mean, it may as well have been $1 million because I didn't have anywhere near that amount. We'd been saving up and doing a little bit of fundraising with One by One, and I think we'd had about the equivalent of 2, maybe 3,000 by this point, but it had taken me months to raise that. And then all of a sudden, I have this bill for 150,000. I mean, talk about impossible. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my goodness, like, I really hope I'm right with this. Like, what if I've kind of conjured up this idea of this promise? And what if it's all me? What if it's, what if it wasn't God at all? Like, what am I going to do? Because I can't afford this. And I remember this pastor coming up to me. This pastor was from America, and he came to our little church in the north of England, and he said, I've got a prophetic word for you. So I said, okay. And I'm waiting for some like really encouraging, inspiring words. And he looked at me and he said, okay, you ready? I was like, yep, sure, go for it. And he said, bananas. And I was like, excuse me now? Bananas. Now, if I'm honest, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, this guy's a little bit special because that's just a little bit weird and wacky and like, I don't get it. And I remember thinking in my mind at the time, well, maybe I'm going to be given a shipment of bananas or something in Kenya and it's going to open doors to the village, or I don't know. What do you do with a prophetic word like that?
Yeah.
I didn't know what to do. So I was just kind of lodged at the back of my mind. But if I'm brutally honest, I didn't think much more about it because I just thought it was a little bit crazy and weird. Well, a little while later, a lady came up to me. She'd heard about my desires to open this residential centre. And she said, I want to do some fundraising, so I'm going to do a sponsored walk. So I was like, brilliant. That's so kind of you. Thank you so much. But again, I didn't really think much on it because if I do a sponsored walk in my hometown, I might raise like £100 and I might even come out with a black eye in the process too. You never know. And so I didn't think a great deal more about it until she got back in touch with me a couple of months later. And she said, I've managed to raise $19,000. I was like, did you walk to the moon?
Whoa.
Like $19,000? Are you serious? And she said, well, my family and friends were incredibly kind and raised $4,000, but one businessman gave me $15,000 for you. So I was like, oh my goodness, that's incredible generosity. Thank you so much. And then my husband said, the next time we're in America, could we possibly meet the businessman just to say thank you? Because, we'd never been given that kind of money. And so she said, well, he's very private. He doesn't normally meet people, but I'll ask. Well, sure enough, a few months later, we were back across the pond again, back over in America. And so we asked our friend, can we meet the businessman? So she asked him, and to her surprise, he said, yes, I'll meet them. So we go to his house, and I'm typically British. So I think we're going for a cup of tea and a little chat, and I just get to say thank you. Except it was nothing like that, Shane. They literally put a chair in the middle of the room and just fired question after question after question at me. It was like a job interview that I'd not applied for. And so I'm thinking, okay. I answered as best as I could. And then at the end of it, this man and his wife talked to each other, and then they suddenly walked back in the room with a second check, this time for another $10,000. So I've known this couple all of 20 minutes, and they've given us $25,000. And so myself and my husband, we said, can we ask, who are you? And he began to explain the businesses that he now owned. And then he said this, but how my family came into money was we used to own a little banana shop called Chiquita Bananas. Chiquita Bananas is now this huge global brand. And you can get it in most supermarkets. This is not a plug. I will buy my bananas at whatever the cheapest rate is, if I'm honest. However, there's a little blue sticker that you often find on a Chiquita banana. I keep that blue sticker in the front of my Bible because that man went on to give us over $100,000 in total. Had we never met him, we would have never been able to do that first centre. And to this day, we constantly have these challenges of faith of, are we willing to step out for that next residential centre or that next country? And every time it takes a lot of faith. It takes a swallow kind of hard and think, okay, God, let's go for it. Like, I hope this works out. But every time I'm tempted to doubt, I open my Bible and I see a little blue sticker. And if God is able to do that right back at the very beginning when we weren't a known organisation, then I think we can just trust him because he's good and he cares far more about ending slavery than I'll ever be capable of. But boy, that little blue sticker, does that help to stir up faith within me.
Oh my God.
So from there, we opened our first centre in Kenya. We opened it on the 12th of the 12th of the 12th. We started with 42 kids. And to watch those children go on over this last more than a decade now, some of them have now qualified as accountants. I've got other kids still in university going on to do marine biology and teachers and all kinds of different professions. And watching these children who were once incredibly vulnerable now go on and live fulfilled lives is just beyond beautiful. But it was because of our work in Kenya that we ended up moving more and more into the anti-slavery sector. So I remember being there in 2015 and a lady in the village approached me and she said, Becky, would you pray for me? My child's gone missing. And so I began to ask her questions about the family and I found out there was a few issues in the family. And so I did what she asked, I prayed with her, but if I'm honest, when I walked away, I negotiated away the problem in my mind by coming up to the conclusion of, well, maybe her and her husband had split up, so maybe the dad has come in and taken the child in order to punish the mum or something like that. The problem was 2 days later, I had a second mum come. And she said, Becky, please would you pray? My little girl's been missing for 5 months and no one knows where she is. So again, I began to ask this second mum the exact same questions, except this time I couldn't negotiate away the problem. There was no tensions in the family. The little girl was doing well in school. She didn't have a boyfriend, and so it was unlikely to be her running away or a teen pregnancy or something like that. And this time I prayed again with this mum, but when I left the conversation, the question very much remained with me. And I remember just thinking, how can a kid just go missing? I began to do some research in the local area and with the other schools and found out that tragically, human trafficking was taking place. And so we began to think, okay, is there a pattern to this? Like, is it a certain time of year? Is it a certain age child? Is it a certain gender? Like, are there any patterns here that we can track so that we can strategically address the situation? And the one common denominator that arose so many times was period poverty. That actually little girls were doing very well in school until they started their monthly cycles. And then at that point, because they didn't have access to sanitary products, they would either drop out of school completely or for at least a week every month, they would miss school. I met some girls who had tried different initiatives, so using grass or old rags and things like that in order to try and still go to school. But sadly, that would often lead to further infections and her missing even more school. And tragically, the traffickers were onto this long before we were. And so they would approach young girls who were dropping out of school at a very young age, like elementary children. And they would say, okay, why don't you come with me to the city? Come be a cook. cook or a cleaner or a nanny, come be a model, whatever line they thought might work. And sadly, the girls went along with them. Many, many girls went. Hollywood would sometimes portray human trafficking of kids being kidnapped off the streets. And that can happen and does happen, but it's far more rare. The vast majority go willingly, having been deceived by the traffickers. So with that in mind, I thought, okay, well, why don't we try and get to the girls before the traffickers do? Let's go into elementary schools, equip girls with reusable sanitary products, so it's not just going to expire after 1 month, but she can use it again and again and again and get the full education that she always deserved. But then combine that with training about what is human trafficking, what are some of the tactics that traffickers use to try and entice children away, and equip them with the knowledge so that they don't fall into those same traps. And we started that in 2015, thinking it was just for our little village in the outbacks of Kenya. Little did I know what would happen. We've actually now taken the Dignity Project across 15 countries, and we've reached more than 51,000 so far. But it was as a result of that we ended up working more and more in the anti-slavery sector. So in 2018, I was invited to take the Dignity Project over to Pakistan. I'd never been there before. I'd heard a lot about the country, and if I'm honest, was probably slightly intimidated from everything that I'd heard. But I thought, okay, it's a 4-day trip. It'll be fine. I mean, how much trouble can you find yourself in on a 4-day trip? I'll get in, I'll get out, it'll be fine. And so we went there and we reached 1,100 girls with the Dignity Project, which was amazing. But then at the end of the trip, they took me into a brick factory. Now, I'd never heard about bonded labour before. But basically, bonded labour is where people are literally born into slavery. And so they will take, it may be their parents or their grandparents would take a loan from a brickmaster to pay for some urgent need, whether that was a dowry, or maybe it was an urgent surgery, maybe it's the roof's just collapsed on the house, something urgent. And so they would take a loan from a brickmaster and then pay for whatever they needed. And then in order to pay back the loan, they would have to work for the brickmaster. It all sounds very legitimate until you realise that actually the interest rate upon the loan is greater than the daily wages. And so we were walking through this brick factory, meeting men, women and children who work for 14 hours a day, paying back a debt that in reality has probably been paid off 100 times over, but it's that debt bondage that keeps them trapped in bonded labour. And so the following year we started a safe house over there in Pakistan, and it's rescuing children out of these brick kilns, putting them in a safe place, because the tragedy of slavery is even if the slavery takes on one form, so this bonded labour, it's forced labour, that's the type of slavery. However, when you're trapped in slavery, there's many more types of abuse that come in. And so many people trapped in slavery have been physically abused. Sadly, many have been sexually abused, and I can't even imagine how it must feel for a parent who doesn't have the right, so to speak, to say no to a brickmaster if he so takes a desire to your daughter. And so many of the little kids that we worked with had been raped and abused. And so our safe house gets them away from that. It gives them a safe bed to sleep in where they're not worried who's going to walk in the room at night. But we also give them a full-time education so that once they graduate, they can go and get legitimate employment and see not just themselves go free, but actually their whole families go free. And so to see that over this last 5, 6, 7 years has just been just remarkable. I remember when we first started working with these children, they were so quiet. And at first it was so different from our centre in Kenya. And at first I'm thinking maybe this is the cultural difference, like the kids in Kenya were just really loud. You'd always hear laughter. And then I'd go across to the safe house in Pakistan and you could literally hear a pin drop. And so I'm thinking maybe it's the cultural differences. Except a year or so later when I returned, these same children were suddenly loud and full of laughter and singing songs and like a typical child would be. And it suddenly dawned on me, they had to learn how to be a child. They'd been born into slavery, and so they were so conditioned that they literally had to learn what it was to be a child. But to see these kids go on and live fulfilled lives is just beautiful. We've actually witnessed several families go free now. And we were able to set them up in their own micro businesses, running little tuk-tuk taxis and other little different sustainable micro businesses so that their whole families can stay free from slavery. And then from there, again, we were back in Kenya doing some different things over there at our centre. And we actually bumped into a child who had been trafficked from Uganda over into Kenya. And I met this little boy who was herding cows, and he explained to one of the graduates that had just finished at our 1x1 centre in Kenya, he explained to him that he doesn't know how to contact his family. He was taken many months ago, and since that point he's not had any education. If he doesn't work hard enough according to his traffickers' opinions, then he won't eat. Like, just really harsh conditions. And when I began to speak, I found out that again that wasn't a rare scenario, that actually there are many children coming across that land border from Uganda into Kenya. And so again, I thought, okay, well, let's take our work upstream. Let's start doing our prevention work over in Uganda to stop the flow of kids coming across that land border. And so we've started working out in Uganda a few years ago. And again, the mentality on my heart and my hope at that moment in time was just to do prevention work. But we started working with the police, training them on what to look out for, what to be aware of, what is trafficking. And the police began to come forward and say, okay, we're starting to identify these kids, but we don't know where to put them. Like, where do we put them while we try and locate their families? They had one little girl, Shane, who was 6 years old, and she'd just been rescued out of 2 years in sex trafficking. She was 6. This precious little girl, when the police got her, she didn't even know the name of her family, let alone the name of the village she was originally taken from. And so the only safe bed that the police had was a police cell. But for a 6-year-old to be brought out of 2 years of utter hell, now being put in a police cell, she doesn't know what she's done wrong. And so the police said, look, we desperately need a safe place. And so it was one of those moments, like looking the little girl on the streets of Sierra Leone in the eyes again, that 9-year-old that I bought a pair of flip-flops for, of how can you turn the other way when there's such a desperate need. And so yet again, it was this huge step of faith, because it was going to cost us an extra £250,000 that we didn't have just laying around spare. If you know anyone who does have a £250,000 just laying around spare, feel free to get them in touch. But we didn't just so happen to have a £250,000 going spare at all. And so yet again, it was a case of saying yes and stepping out, even though what we had at that moment in time was nowhere near enough for the need. But time and time again, as we've stepped out and said yes, like going out with our hands open and just been like, okay, we don't have much, but if you can use this. As we've stepped out and said yes, the money has begun to come in. And so we opened our first ever Mercy Centre in May of 2025. It's specifically for girls rescued out of trafficking. So the age limit is 17 is the eldest, and then the youngest is 6 to 7, just because the legal requirements for under that are different in terms of staff ratio. And so anything from 6 up to 17. And actually the average age of the children we've worked with over this last year has been 12, just 12 years of age. And they've come from lots of different types of backgrounds. So some were forced labour, some were domestic servitude, so where a little girl's taken out of school and made to work for a wealthier family as a cook or a cleaner. And then some have come from sex trafficking. And so the levels of trauma are incredibly high. So they come to our centre and we've got counsellors and full-time nurses. We do trauma therapy. And we work quite intensively with these little girls. They stay with us from anything from 3 up to 6 months. And then as soon as they move in, our social workers begin working on the exit strategy. So our social workers have the very difficult job of family tracing to see if we can locate their families. And then beyond that, finding out were their families involved in the trafficking. If so, was that out of ignorance? They did it thinking they were sending their child for a better life, for example, or did they actually sell their child into slavery? Obviously, if it is that, we can't place a child, we won't place a child back into that situation. And so we do a lot of work, we do months of work with the families before we relocate the girls back home.
That's good.
But last year we had one, I'll tell you one of the stories of one of the many girls that have come through over this last year. And so we had a little girl, we call her Deborah, that's not her real name, but we call her Deborah just to protect her real identity. But Deborah was 10 when her mum sent her out just to go get some water, very common scenario across rural parts of Africa. And so Deborah sets out with her little bucket to go get some water. And as she's going out, she bumps into a family friend. This man had been in her home before. She knew his face. She knew his name. And he said, "Oh, Deborah, why don't you come with me? I want to buy a gift for your big sister. Come and help me choose something." And so forgetting all about the water, off she goes with this man because he's not a stranger. She'd learnt about stranger danger at school, but she knows this man and he wants to do something lovely for her big sister. So it felt safe. Off she went with him. Sadly, he had very different intentions. And so he lured Deborah to an isolated area where first he inducted her, which means he raped her. And then he began to sell her little body out to others. At the end of what can only be described as a brutal day, he then strangled her and placed her little body into a sugar sack and left her on this sugar plantation, and off he ran with all the money. Well, thankfully, a passerby was going and saw this sugar sack moving by itself. And so they went over to see what it was, thinking an animal had got itself trapped in a bag. And when they went over and undid the knot and opened it, to their horror, they found little 10-year-old Deborah. Deborah was rushed to the hospital, and then obviously the police met her there at the hospital. She was brought directly from the hospital to our Mercy Centre in July last year. And when she first moved in, she was incredibly guarded, very withdrawn, very quiet, wouldn't respond, wouldn't react, was very withdrawn, and understandably so because of the trauma she'd endured. Well, our staff worked very patiently with her, and as from the point where she began to feel safe, the healing began to take place. Through our counsellors and our trauma therapists, they began to break down the walls and see this little girl start to come back to life, quite literally. And we were able to work with her with, we do a lot of what we call CBT therapy, which is a lot of talking therapy, but with our young girls, sometimes that's too hard, it's too much. The brain's not even necessarily advanced enough to formulate the words to put to their trauma. And so we do art therapy and play therapy. And little by little, Deborah began to recover. Well, through that, not only have we seen her healing take place, but also we were able to get more information to the police. And her perpetrator is now serving time in jail. And to see justice take place is a huge part of her healing. And then in December of last year, I had the absolute honour of going out and meeting Deborah. And the little girl I encountered was a very happy, joyful little girl. She wanted to show me this dance that she'd just choreographed with her friends in the Mercy Centre, and she was full of energy and life and confidence, which was vastly different from the little girl who'd first joined us in July. And I had the honour of accompanying the social worker of taking Deborah home last Christmas and watching her restored back to her mom and her little brothers and sisters was just a moment that will stay with me forever. Because the reality is, taking Deborah home was like taking the little 9-year-old 2 decades ago home. And to watch that take place is just incredibly powerful and beautiful. And there's been challenges along the way. It's not always a happy story. When you're working in this sector, we've come across 3-year-olds who have been killed as a result of being in slavery. But for every child that we get to take home, it drives you on for that next one child, that next one country, that next one brick factory, to keep on keeping on, even if it's just one life at a time. Let's keep on keeping on, because how can we say no when there's so many issues? There's 50 million trapped in modern day slavery today. But I'm a big believer that one by one, we'll begin to see that stat drop, because every single one of us can make a big difference if we're just willing to use whatever is in our hands today, even if that just looks like 50 pence on a pair of flip-flops. Who knew what could take place by just saying yes?
Absolutely. You probably saw me getting teary-eyed as you were speaking. I just think the reason why the Lord has blessed you and blessed you all so much is because you truly care, and you're truly trying to do right, and you're truly trying to help these children. Because, you know, I can only imagine, having to see everything you've seen has been rough. At times even depressing, I'm sure. Um, but just hearing about everything that you all have done over multiple countries, people speaking into you all, giving you prophecy, blessing you monetarily, it's not a shocker, because you guys are doing the Lord's work out here. Um, can you kind of go in detail about when you spoke at the White House? How was that experience speaking at the White House, at the House of Parliament, and how did that feel? I know you're also a presenter on TVN, so can you kind of go into detail? How was that the first time you were introduced to that sphere? And yeah, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, so it was the White House I was invited into first, and it was connected to the work we're specifically doing in Pakistan. And so when you are boots on the ground, as it were, in certain locations, it gives you a unique viewpoint, as it were. And so a lot of what we do is very strategic. So we work across more than 50 brick factories where we're helping families and children, but at the same time, it gives us an insight into what's going on. What does the slavery look like? What does the trafficking look like? And so we work with governments, because if we can get the West to put pressure on Pakistan government, for example, then you can see long-term national change. So as much as our heart is always for the one, and we will continue going into brick factory after brick factory, reaching child after child, but at the same time, we also want to see long-term national change. And so having the honor of being invited into the White House was just unbelievable. I was such a tourist. I walked around. I had to be escorted the whole time, because obviously I'm a Brit, I'm not a local. So I had to be escorted the whole time. But I was just like mouth wide open, just walking around, just such an honor. And then within weeks of that, I was invited into 10 Downing Street. And I think they'd heard the Americans have had her in. She's one of our own. We better get her in. And so I was invited into Downing Street. And again, walking through this amazing building full of history. You walk up the big staircase, and they've got the pictures of the prime ministers from past at the bottom right up to present at the top. And again, just I felt like such a tourist walking around. But in those moments, there was a dialogue going on internally in me. And the dialogue was this: who do you think you are? You need to pipe down and get back in your place. You see, you're just from a working class estate in the north of England. Who do you think you are? And all of these insecurities and doubts, because I am all too aware of my faults and failings. I am not the most academic person in the world, and suddenly I'm surrounded by these people in the White House who studied at Harvard and like amazing Yale and all these amazing establishments. And then likewise in London, Downing Street, you've got people who studied at Oxford and Cambridge, and I'm like, who am I to advise these incredibly intelligent people? And I've never felt imposter syndrome so much as right there in that moment. But then all of a sudden it dawned on me, like so many times we have our eyes on ourselves, me, myself, and I, rather than on the fact that those doors were open is nothing about to do with me or about me. But I had the unique opportunity and deep responsibility to speak up on behalf of every life that is currently muted, for every girl still in a brothel, for every little boy still working on a brick factory. How dare I try and shrink back because I feel inadequate? And so all of a sudden with that in mind, I was like, okay, come on, Becky, you're a big girl, you can do this. And so I went in and I had amazing meetings, but I was full of fear and intimidation, if I am honest. But I am glad that I didn't shrink back even when I wanted to, because it was an incredible honor to speak up on behalf of the kids that One by One represents.
That's powerful. That is powerful, Becky. Um, you know, I just had an epiphany. Literally, I now understand why it's called One by One. I now understand why it's called One by One, and I honestly just feel blessed to be the one to share your story, because people need to hear stories like these, and people need to know that hey, there are good people out there, good organizations out there that really want to help, really want to help these kids. Um, because to be a kid is such a their minds are not equipped to process everything that we deal with on a daily basis. It's such innocence in there. They only have a heart to love, and when that's abused and when that's being used against them, it can be traumatizing. So I can only imagine how heartbreaking that was at the same time. But all that to say, you are the person for the job. And even the pastor that spoke life into you and gave you that prophecy that wasn't clear at that time, but you saw that in fruition come to fruition. And as I said before, the monetary blessings, you all never had to worry about being short. And I'm sure there were some hard times, but you know um you all never had to worry about that because God was always at the center. And so I just think that is so amazing. So, if there's one more thing I have to ask you, Becky, how can people connect with one on one, whether through your website or through Instagram, and how can people just stay connected?
Absolutely. So the website is onebyone.org. So they can go there, and on social media, it is Becky at One by One. And so they can find us on all the usual Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're even on TikTok now. Like, I feel cooler than I am because we're now on TikTok. Like,
There we go.
But we love people to connect with us. So whether that's through, you can do anything from sharing a post on your own social media platform to help raise awareness. You can check out the website to potentially look at joining us on a missions trip. Maybe come out with us and join a Dignity Project team at some point in the future. Or you can give towards it. You can pray towards it. We love people to connect with us. So please do get in touch.
So, with that being said, I just want to say thank you, Becky, for spending your time to come here to the podcast and just share your story. If you are really enjoy Becky's story, stay connected with one on one the ways that she provided as well. And I just hope that you guys know that God has a purpose and a plan for you. All you have to do is seek him, knock, and he will answer. The door would be open for you. Um, and whether it's people like Becky or just anyone that you've heard of, who's doing purpose work, um, it can happen for you as well. And just keep the hope and the faith alive. So, Becky, once again, I know I keep saying it, but it was just such a powerful story. I keep getting teary eyed, but thank you again. And I hope you have a blessed day, okay? Thank you guys.
Thank you.